They snickered when she walked into the tactical training center wearing her coffee-stained apron. The elite operators mocked her soft voice and gentle demeanor. But when Zoe Patterson stepped up to the weapon assembly station, the entire room fell silent. No one expected what happened next. 12 seconds that would shatter every assumption they'd made. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the windows of Morning Brew Café in downtown Cedarville, casting golden streaks across the worn wooden floors. Zoe Patterson stood behind the espresso machine, her practiced hands working with the same precision she'd once used for very different tools. Steam hissed as she crafted another perfect latte, the foam art taking shape with movements that seemed almost military in their efficiency. At 28, Zoe had the kind of quiet presence that made customers feel immediately at ease. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her warm brown eyes held a depth that suggested she'd seen more of the world than most baristas her age. She wore a simple black t-shirt under her apron, no jewelry except for a small silver chain that disappeared beneath her collar, a chain that held dog tags she never showed anyone. "Another perfect Rosetta," commented her coworker Jamie, watching Zoe finish the latte art. "I swear you could do that blindfolded." Zoe smiled, handing the drink to the waiting customer. "Just muscle memory," she replied, though her definition of muscle memory ran much deeper than coffee preparation. The cafe buzzed with its usual morning crowd, lawyers grabbing their caffeine fix before court, students hunched over laptops, retirees lingering over newspapers. To them, Zoe was simply the friendly barista who remembered their orders and never got overwhelmed during the rush. They saw her gentle demeanor, her patient way with difficult customers, her willingness to stay late when needed. What they didn't see was the way she unconsciously scanned each person who entered, cataloging potential threats. They didn't notice how she positioned herself with clear sightlines to all exits, or how her seemingly casual stance was actually a relaxed ready position. "Zoe, table 6 is asking for you specifically," Jamie called out, nodding toward a corner table where an elderly man sat alone with his coffee. Zoe walked over, recognizing Mr. Henderson, a regular who came in every Tuesday and Thursday. He was a Vietnam veteran who'd taken a liking to her quiet competence. "How are you doing today, Mr. Henderson?" she asked, refilling his cup from the pot she'd brought over. "Better now that I've got decent coffee," he chuckled, then studied her face. "You know, every time I watch you work, I'm reminded of the discipline they taught us in the service. You've got that same attention to detail." Zoe's hand paused almost imperceptibly as she poured. "Just trying to make good coffee, sir." Henderson nodded knowingly. "Different uniform, same dedication." He lowered his voice. "Army?" After a moment's hesitation, Zoe nodded. "Marines, actually." 4 years. Thought so. What was your MOS? "Military police," she said simply, though that was only part of the story. Her actual specialization had been in weapons and tactical operations. But she'd learned that sharing those details often made people uncomfortable. Henderson smiled. "Well, their loss is our gain. This place runs smoother with you here." As Zoe returned to the counter, her phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it while wiping down the espresso machine, and her expression shifted slightly. The message was from her friend Lisa Montgomery, now a sergeant at the Iron Wolf Tactical Center. "Competition this weekend. Weapons assembly, tactical scenarios. You should come. Show these wannabes what real training looks like." Zoe deleted the message without responding, as she had the previous dozen invitations. She'd left that world behind for a reason. The transition from military to civilian life hadn't been easy, and she'd found peace in the simple routines of cafe work. No life or death decisions, no weapons, no proving herself to anyone. Just coffee, conversation, and the satisfaction of a job well done. But as the morning wore on, she couldn't shake the text from her mind. Through the lunch rush, during the afternoon lull, even as she cleaned the machines at closing time, Lisa's words echoed, "Show these wannabes what real training looks like." That evening, in her small apartment above the used bookstore next to the cafe, Zoe sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, staring at her phone. The apartment was spartanly furnished but comfortable, a reflection of someone who'd learned to value function over form. On the bookshelf sat a single framed photo, her Marine unit, all smiles and camaraderie, taken during a brief respite in their deployment. She picked up the photo, studying the faces of her fellow Marines. Where were they now? Some had stayed in climbing the ranks. Others had transitioned to law enforcement or private security. A few had struggled with the adjustment, fighting battles that didn't end when they came home. And here she was, making lattes and avoiding anything that reminded her of who she used to be. Her phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. The caller ID showed Dad. "Hey, sweetheart," came Frank Patterson's familiar voice. "How was your day?" "Good, Dad. Busy morning, quiet afternoon, the usual." "That's good to hear." There was a pause, and she could hear the sounds of his woodworking shop in the background. Frank had been a Navy Seabee for 22 years before retiring to become a carpenter. "You know, I ran into Tom Morrison at the hardware store today." "You remember Tom? He was in my unit?" "Yeah, I remember him." "Well, he's got a son who's organizing some kind of tactical training event this weekend. Says they're looking for experienced people to help demonstrate proper techniques." "I thought maybe—" "Dad," Zoe interrupted gently. "I'm not interested." I know. But honey, you can't hide from who you are forever. You had skills that most people only dream of. There's no shame in that." Zoe closed her eyes. This was a conversation they'd had many times before. "I'm not hiding. I'm just living a different life now. Making coffee for a living when you could be training the next generation of operators." "Zoe, you were the best weapons specialist in your unit. Your sergeant told me you could field strip and reassemble any rifle faster than most people could load it. That was a long time ago. It was 4 years ago. And muscle memory doesn't just disappear." Frank's voice softened. "Look, I'm not saying you should go back to active duty. But maybe sharing your knowledge, helping others learn proper techniques. Maybe that's a way to honor your service without compromising the peace you've found." After they hung up, Zoe sat in the quiet of her apartment, the photo still in her hands. She thought about the Marines she'd served with, the pride they'd taken in their expertise, the lives they'd protected through their skill and dedication. She thought about the wannabes Lisa had mentioned, people who played at being tactical operators without understanding the true weight of the skills they were mimicking. Maybe it was time to remind them what real training looked like. The next morning, as she prepared for another day at the cafe, Zoe made a decision that would change everything. She picked up her phone and typed a message to Lisa. "What time does the competition start?" Lisa's response came within minutes. "Can't believe you're finally coming. Event starts at 0900. Weapons assembly competition at 1100. These guys have been bragging for weeks about their times. They need a reality check." Zoe stared at the message, second-guessing herself already. It had been over 2 years since she'd touched a military-grade weapon. 2 years of deliberately distancing herself from that world, from the memories and responsibilities that came with it. But Lisa's next message made her pause. "Seriously, though, some of these civilians think they're operators because they watched a few YouTube videos. It's getting dangerous. Real training saves lives." That afternoon, during her break, Zoe called her father back. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began without preamble. Frank's voice perked up. "About the training event?" "Yeah, maybe. You're right, maybe I am hiding." She took a deep breath. "Tell me about Tom Morrison's son." "His name's David. Good kid. actually served a tour overseas with the Army. He's trying to set up legitimate tactical training for civilians and law enforcement. The problem is, he's got some participants who think they know more than they do. Zoe nodded, though her father couldn't see her. She'd encountered the type before, civilians, who collected military gear and practiced tactical movements, but had never faced the real consequences of those skills. What kind of competition is it? From what Tom told me, it's designed to showcase proper technique, weapons handling, assembly and disassembly, tactical movement. The idea is to separate the serious students from the weekend warriors. And you think I should go because... Frank's voice became serious. Because in 2 weeks there was an incident at a similar event in the next county. Some overconfident civilian had a negligent discharge because he thought he knew weapon safety better than the instructors. Nobody was hurt, thank God, but it could have been a lot worse. Zoe felt a familiar weight settle in her chest. The responsibility she'd carried as a Marine, the knowledge that proper training wasn't just about looking cool, it was about keeping people alive. What time is the event? Saturday morning. Starts at 9. That evening, Zoe found herself in her bedroom closet, pushing aside the civilian clothes to reach the corner where she kept a small duffel bag. She hadn't opened it since moving to Cedarville. Inside, carefully folded, were her old fatigues not for wearing, but because throwing them away had felt like discarding a part of herself. Beneath the clothes were her certifications. Expert, Marksman, Advanced Weapons Specialist, Military Police Academy Honors Graduate. At the bottom of the bag, wrapped in a soft cloth, were her dog tags. She lifted them out, feeling the familiar weight of the metal, reading her own information etched in the steel. Patterson, Zoe MUSMC. Her phone rang, startling her. It was Lisa. Please tell me you're not backing out, Lisa said without greeting. I'm not backing out. I'm just ... It's been a while. How long since you've handled weapons? 2 years, 3 months, 12 days. The precision of her answer surprised even her. Lisa was quiet for a moment. You know it doesn't leave you, right? It's like riding a bike, except the bike can save lives. I know. It's not the skills I'm worried about. Then what? Zoe sat on the edge of her bed, still holding her dog tags. What if I've changed too much? What if I'm not who I used to be? Zoe, listen to me. I've seen you in action. I've watched you strip and reassemble an M4 blindfolded in under 15 seconds. I've seen you keep your cool under pressure that would break most people. That doesn't just disappear because you're making coffee now. 15 seconds, Zoe murmured. My best time was 12. Exactly, and these guys? The fastest time this group has recorded is 38 seconds. And that was with fumbling and unsafe weapon handling. After ending the call, Zoe made a decision. She went to her computer and pulled up videos of weapon assembly competitions, watching with a critical eye that had been trained by some of the best instructors in the world. What she saw made her wince. Sloppy technique, unsafe handling, and worst of all, arrogant confidence in flawed methods. One video showed a competitor who'd managed a 20-second assembly time while making at least 6 safety violations. Comments were full of praise from viewers who didn't know enough to spot the errors. Another video featured someone explaining tactical gear setups while demonstrating improper grip techniques that would compromise accuracy and control. This is exactly what Dad was talking about, she thought. These weren't people learning proper skills. They were people reinforcing dangerous habits while thinking they were experts. The next morning at the cafe, Zoe found herself moving with a different energy. She was still the same friendly barista, but there was a purpose in her movements that hadn't been there before. When Mr. Henderson came in for his usual Tuesday coffee, he noticed immediately. You look different today, he observed as she brought his coffee over. More like the Marine I suspected you were. Zoe smiled. I'm thinking about attending a training event this weekend. Getting back to my roots, you might say. Good for you. The world needs people who know the difference between playing soldier and being one. I'm nervous about it, she admitted. It's been a while since I've been around that environment. Henderson leaned forward. You know what the difference is between a real professional and a wannabe? The professional knows they still have things to learn. The wannabe thinks they already know everything. That afternoon, Zoe called Lisa one more time. I'll be there Saturday. But I want to understand exactly what I'm walking into. It's supposed to be a friendly competition, but honestly, some of these guys have turned it into a pissing contest. The main group is led by a civilian named Connor Hayes, ex-military wannabe who never actually served, but talks like he invented tactical operations. He's got a crew of followers who hang on his every word. And they think they're hot stuff? Connor's been bragging that his 38-second assembly time makes him competition ready. He's planning to start teaching tactical courses to law enforcement. The scary part is, some departments are actually considering hiring him. Zoe felt a chill. The thought of improperly trained instructors teaching life-saving skills to police officers was exactly the kind of scenario that led to accidents, injuries, or worse. I'll be there, she said firmly. As Saturday morning approached, Zoe prepared with the same methodical precision she'd once used for missions. She chose her clothing carefully: practical jeans, sturdy boots, and a simple t-shirt that wouldn't restrict movement. No logos, no tactical gear, nothing to announce her background. Let them underestimate her. Saturday arrived with clear skies and cool morning air. As Zoe drove toward the Iron Wolf Tactical Center in her modest Honda Civic, she felt the familiar pre-mission butterflies. But underneath the nervousness was something else: anticipation. For the first time in over 2 years, she was going to use the skills that had once defined her. It was time to show them what real training looked like. The Iron Wolf Tactical Center sat on 40 acres of converted farmland, about 20 minutes outside Cedarville. As Zoe turned into the gravel driveway, she was struck by how professional the facility looked. Unlike some of the backyard setups she'd seen online, this was clearly a legitimate operation. The main building was a converted barn painted in military green, with several smaller outbuildings and what looked like a well-maintained outdoor range stretching into the distance. Vehicles filled the parking area, mostly pickup trucks and SUVs, many sporting military or law enforcement decals. Zoe's modest Honda looked decidedly out of place among the lifted trucks with tactical accessories and bumper stickers proclaiming various military units and patriotic slogans. She parked at the far end of the lot, taking a moment to observe the scene. Groups of men clustered around their vehicles, some in full tactical gear despite the event being listed as casual dress. She could hear voices carrying across the parking area, confident, loud discussions about equipment and techniques. The body language was familiar: chests puffed out, gestures wide and emphatic, the unmistakable posture of people trying to establish dominance in a group. Zoe grabbed her small backpack containing only water, a notebook, and her identification, and walked toward the main building. She'd deliberately chosen not to bring any gear, wanting to see what the event provided and how the organizers handled equipment safety. The registration table was set up just inside the main entrance, staffed by a young woman in military-style clothing who looked like she knew what she was doing. This had to be Lisa Montgomery, though they'd never met in person. "You must be Zoe," Lisa said, looking up with a grin. "I recognize you from the photos Frank showed David." "Guilty as charged." Zoe smiled back, immediately liking Lisa's no-nonsense demeanor. "Thanks for the invitation. I have to admit, I'm curious to see what we're dealing with here." Lisa lowered her voice as she handed Zoe a registration packet. "Brace yourself. Connor Hayes and his crew are already here, and they're in full peacock mode. They've been holding court by the equipment table for the last hour, explaining to anyone who'll listen why their techniques are superior to military doctrine. Zoe raised an eyebrow. Superior to military doctrine? According to Connor, the Marines don't know proper weapon handling because they're trained for battlefield conditions, rather than precision operations. Lisa made air quotes, her expression conveying exactly what she thought of that logic. Interesting theory, Zoe said dryly. I assume he has extensive combat experience to back up this claim. 3 years in the National Guard, never deployed. But he's got a YouTube channel with 40,000 subscribers, so clearly he's an expert. The registration packet included a schedule of events, safety briefing information, and a waiver that was surprisingly thorough. Zoe was impressed by the legal coverage. Whoever had written this understood the potential liabilities of tactical training events. The weapons assembly competition is scheduled for 11, Lisa explained. Before that, we're doing a safety briefing and basic weapons handling demonstration. I strongly suggest you stick around for Connor's presentation on advanced tactical assembly techniques. Her tone suggested this would be educational, but not in the way Connor intended. As they spoke, a loud voice boomed from across the room. The key to speed is understanding the weapon as an extension of yourself. You can't just memorize the steps. You have to internalize the entire process until it becomes instinctive. Zoe turned to see a tall man in his early 30s addressing a small crowd. He wore what could only be described as tactical casual cargo pants, a fitted shirt with some kind of military-style logo, and boots that looked expensive but showed little wear. His hair was styled in a high and tight fade that suggested military service, but something about his posture screamed civilian. That's Connor, Lisa whispered. Watch this. Connor had an M4 rifle laid out on a table in front of him, partially disassembled. Now, the military teaches a 7-step process for field stripping, but I've developed a more efficient 6-step method that reduces time while maintaining safety. He began demonstrating, his movements confident, but lacking the fluid efficiency that came from thousands of repetitions under pressure. Zoe watched with the critical eye of someone who'd been trained by Marine Corps weapon instructors. Connor's technique wasn't wrong, exactly, but it was inefficient. He was making several unnecessary movements, and his grip positioning would slow him down in a timed environment. More concerning, he was treating the demonstration like a performance, rather than a training exercise, focusing more on impressing his audience than ensuring they understood the principles behind each step. What's his best time? Zoe asked quietly. 38 seconds, like I mentioned. But that was under ideal conditions with his own rifle that he'd pre-staged for the attempt. Pre-staged how? Loosened all the pins beforehand, cleaned and lubricated. Everything to reduce friction, basically optimized for speed rather than demonstrating actual field conditions. Zoe nodded. That explained a lot. A real weapons assembly test would use a rifle in standard condition, not one that had been prepared specifically for speed runs. And he's proud of 38 seconds? Enormously. He's been telling everyone it's a near record time for civilian competitions. As Connor continued his demonstration, more participants gathered to watch. Zoe studied the crowd, noting the mix of genuine interest and sycophantic admiration. Some of the watchers were clearly experienced, she could tell by their posture, and the way their eyes tracked Connor's movements with critical assessment. But others hung on his every word with the enthusiasm of people who'd never seen real expertise. The secret, Connor was saying, is understanding that speed comes from confidence, and confidence comes from knowing you're using the most advanced techniques available. One of the observers, an older man with the bearing of actual military experience, asked, "What about the safety protocols? Aren't you skipping the chamber inspection?" Connor's smile tightened slightly. In a competition environment, we can assume the weapons are cleared by range safety officers. Real operators learn to adapt their procedures to the situation. The older man frowned but didn't pursue the point. Zoe made a mental note. Connor was teaching shortcuts that could be dangerous in real-world applications, justifying them with appeals to real operator mentality. "Ladies and gentlemen," came an announcement from the front of the room. "We'll be starting our safety briefing in 5 minutes. Please gather in the main presentation area." As the crowd began to move, Connor's voice rose above the general chatter. "After the briefing, I'll be demonstrating the assembly technique that earned me my best time. Should be educational for anyone serious about improving their performance." Zoe followed the group toward the presentation area, her mind already analyzing what she'd observed. Connor Hayes was exactly the type of instructor she'd been warned about: confident enough to be convincing, knowledgeable enough to avoid obvious errors, but lacking the depth of experience to understand why certain procedures existed. He was teaching technique without teaching judgment, speed without teaching safety. As they settled into folding chairs, arranged in rows facing a small stage, Lisa leaned over to whisper, "The real fun starts after the safety briefing. Connor's planning to challenge anyone who thinks they can beat his time." Zoe smiled quietly. "Is that so? He's been talking all week about how this competition will separate the serious practitioners from the wannabes. Apparently, anyone who can't break 40 seconds isn't worth training." The irony wasn't lost on Zoe. In a few hours, Connor Hayes was about to learn the difference between real expertise and YouTube confidence. She just hoped he'd be mature enough to learn from the experience rather than making excuses. The safety briefing was about to begin, and Zoe settled back to observe. Soon enough, it would be time to show them what 12 seconds looked like. The safety briefing was conducted by David Morrison, Tom's son, and Zoe immediately recognized the difference between him and Connor. David's presentation was methodical, thorough, and focused entirely on preventing accidents. He covered range commands, equipment inspection protocols, and emergency procedures with the efficiency of someone who understood that safety wasn't negotiable. "Before we begin any live fire or weapon handling exercises," David announced, "I want to make one thing absolutely clear. This is not a competition to see who can be the most reckless. Speed means nothing if it compromises safety. Anyone who violates safety protocols will be immediately removed from the event." Connor shifted in his seat, and Zoe caught his eye roll at what he apparently considered an overly cautious approach. Several of his followers mimicked his dismissive body language. After the briefing, participants moved outside to the equipment area where various stations had been set up. The weapons assembly station featured a table with several identical M4 rifles, all properly cleared and inspected. A large digital timer was mounted on a post, visible to both participants and observers. "Before we start the timed competition," David announced, "we'll have a demonstration of proper assembly technique. Connor Hayes has volunteered to show us his method." Connor stepped forward with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. He wore a satisfied smile as he approached the table, clearly enjoying the opportunity to display his skills before a new audience. "Thanks, David," Connor said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I think it's important for people to see what's possible when you move beyond basic military instruction to more advanced techniques." Zoe positioned herself where she could observe both Connor's technique and the reactions of the crowd. Several participants had pulled out phones to record, apparently expecting to witness something impressive. Connor picked up one of the M4s, holding it up for the crowd to see. "This is a standard M4 carbine, but there's nothing standard about how we're going to approach it. The military teaches a methodical approach that prioritizes following orders over efficiency. In the real world, efficiency saves lives." The older man who'd questioned Connor earlier, Zoe, learned his name was Bill, frowned at this characterization. "The military teaches methodical approaches because they work under stress. Efficiency that breaks down under pressure isn't really efficient." Connor's smile became patronizing. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that holds people back. Bill, is it? With respect, the modern tactical environment requires adaptation. We can't be limited by training that was designed for a different era. Zoe bit her tongue. Connor was setting up a false dichotomy, presenting speed and safety as opposing concepts rather than complementary skills that required proper training to master together. Let's see what modern tactical training looks like, Connor continued. Settling into position at the table. Timer starts when I touch the rifle, stops when I fire the action, and it clicks on an empty chamber. David operated the timer while Connor prepared. The crowd fell silent as Connor's hands moved to the rifle. Starting in 3, 2, 1, go. Connor's hands flew across the weapon with practiced movements. He was clearly experienced, but Zoe immediately spotted inefficiencies in his technique. His grip changes were awkward. He was using more force than necessary to manipulate the pins, and his sequencing, while functional, wasn't optimized for speed. Still, his movements were confident, and he encountered no major fumbles. The rifle came apart cleanly, and he reversed the process with similar efficiency. When the action clicked on the empty chamber, the timer read 36.8 seconds. The crowd erupted in impressed murmurs and scattered applause. Connor stood up with a satisfied grin, clearly pleased with his performance. 36.8, he announced. Not my personal best, but not bad for a demonstration run. He looked around the crowd with the expression of someone expecting to be challenged. Anyone think they can do better? Several people shook their heads, apparently intimidated by what they'd witnessed. A few younger participants looked at Connor with obvious admiration. But Zoe noticed that Bill and a couple other observers didn't seem particularly impressed. "I'll give it a try," said Trevor Baldwin, one of Connor's regular followers. Trevor was in his late 20s, wore expensive tactical gear, and had been nodding enthusiastically throughout Connor's demonstration. Trevor's attempt was less smooth than Connor's. His hands shook slightly from nerves, and he fumbled one of the pins during reassembly. His final time was 52.3 seconds, which still earned him congratulatory comments from the Connor faction. Not bad for someone who's been training for less than a year, Connor said approvingly. Trevor's showing good improvement. With proper instruction, he'll be breaking 40 seconds soon. A few more participants tried, with times ranging from 48 to 67 seconds. The slower performers received encouraging comments, but Zoe noticed that Connor's encouragement came with subtle implications that they needed his particular style of training to improve. Throughout the demonstrations, Connor had been scanning the crowd, clearly looking for serious challengers. His gaze passed over Zoe without interest. She was standing quietly with the other observers. Nothing about her appearance suggesting tactical experience. "Anyone else want to give it a shot?" Connor asked. "Remember, this isn't just about the time. It's about demonstrating mastery of the weapon system." Bill stepped forward. "I'll try." Connor's eyebrows rose slightly. Bill was probably in his 60s, with gray hair and the solid build of someone who'd spent decades in physical work. "Of course," Connor said graciously, though Zoe caught the hint of condescension. "Experience is always welcome." Bill's approach to the table was unhurried. He picked up the rifle with the casual familiarity of someone who'd handled thousands of weapons over the years. When David started the timer, Bill's movements were economical and precise. No wasted motion, no hesitation, just the fluid efficiency. That came from muscle memory built over decades. His final time was 34.1 seconds. The crowd was quiet for a moment, processing what they'd just witnessed. Connor's confident smile flickered briefly before returning full force. "Very nice," Connor said, though his tone suggested he'd been expecting this result. 34 seconds is solid. "Bill, what's your background?" 22 years Army." Bill replied simply, "Weapons sergeant for most of it." "That explains it," Connor said with a knowing nod. "Real military experience shows. Though I have to say, Even with your background, you're still using some of the older techniques. With some refinement, you could probably knock a few more seconds off. Bill's expression suggested he had thoughts about Connor's refinement, but he simply nodded politely and stepped back into the crowd. Connor looked around again. Anyone else? We've got time for a few more attempts before we move to the next event. The parking lot had continued to fill during the demonstrations, and Zoe noticed several new arrivals joining the crowd. Among them were a few women, though they seemed to be there primarily as observers rather than participants. "What about you ladies?" Connor asked, gesturing toward the women with what he probably thought was inclusive enthusiasm. "This isn't just a boys' club. We welcome anyone serious about tactical training." One of the women, probably in her 40s and wearing a sheriff's department t-shirt, looked interested. "What's the fastest time you've seen from a woman?" Connor paused, clearly thinking, that's a great question. I don't think we've had any women attempt the timed assembly before. But there's no reason why proper training couldn't produce similar results regardless of gender. His phrasing made Zoe wince. The assumption that women would naturally be slower, combined with the patronizing suggestion that proper training could help them overcome this inherent disadvantage, revealed exactly the kind of thinking she'd encountered throughout her military career. The sheriff's deputy looked less enthusiastic after Connor's response. "Maybe I'll just observe for now." "Of course," Connor said smoothly. "Observation is an important part of learning." As the crowd began to disperse toward other stations, Connor caught sight of Zoe for the first time. She was still standing quietly at the edge of the group, and something about her stillness seemed to register with him. "How about you?" he called out. "Want to give it a try?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. All eyes turned to Zoe as Connor's invitation hung in the air. She had been hoping to observe a bit longer, to get a better feel for the group dynamics before revealing her capabilities. But Connor's direct challenge, delivered with that particular tone of voice that suggested he was doing her a favor by including her, made stepping back impossible. "Sure," Zoe said simply, walking toward the table. "I'll give it a try." As she approached, Connor's expression shifted subtly. Up close, he was reassessing her, taking in her unremarkable clothing, her lack of tactical gear, her quiet demeanor. She could see him categorizing her as another observer who'd gotten caught up in the moment. "Great," Connor said with exaggerated enthusiasm. "Don't worry about the time. This is all about learning proper technique. The important thing is to stay safe and follow the steps." Trevor Baldwin, still basking in the glow of Connor's earlier praise for his 52-second time, stepped closer. "First time handling an M4? He asked Zoe with friendly condescension. "I've seen them before," Zoe replied neutrally. "They can be tricky if you're not used to military hardware," added Ethan Cross, another member of Connor's regular group. Ethan was probably in his early 30s, with the kind of precisely groomed tactical beard that suggested he spent more time on appearance than training. "The pins can be stubborn if you don't know the right technique." Connor nodded sagely. "Ethan's right. These aren't hunting rifles. Military weapons require a different approach. Don't be discouraged if it takes a few tries to get the hang of it." Zoe approached the table where the M4 waited. She could feel the weight of expectations from the crowd, most of them clearly expecting to witness a demonstration of exactly why this competition was beyond the abilities of untrained civilians. Connor's followers seemed particularly eager to see their instructor's superiority confirmed. "Take your time to familiarize yourself with the weapon," Connor said, adopting what he probably thought was an instructional tone. "Feel free to ask questions about any of the components." Zoe picked up the rifle, and immediately her hands remembered. The weight, the balance, the texture of the grip it all came flooding back with the intensity of muscle memory built through thousands of repetitions. For just a moment, she was back in training, back in the field, back in the world where this weapon had been as familiar as her own hands. But she kept her expression neutral, even slightly uncertain as she examined the rifle. "This pin here," she said, pointing to the front takedown pin. "This comes out first?" "Actually," Connor said, stepping closer, "let me show you the proper sequence. You want to start with the rear pin. It provides better control during disassembly." He reached over to guide her hands, and Zoe had to resist the urge to correct him. Connor's preferred sequence wasn't wrong, but it wasn't the most efficient approach. More importantly, his need to physically guide her hands revealed his assumption that she couldn't possibly understand the process from verbal instruction alone. "Got it," Zoe said, allowing him to position her hands. "And then this part here?" "That's the bolt carrier group," Trevor chimed in helpfully. "It's the heart of the operating system. The what now?" Zoe asked, playing up confusion. Connor's smile became more pronounced. "Don't worry about the technical terms right now. Just focus on following the steps I showed you. Remember, safety first, speed never." Several more participants had gathered to watch, drawn by the novelty of seeing someone who was clearly out of her depth attempt the challenge. Zoe caught fragments of whispered conversations. "Poor girl, she has no idea what she's gotten herself into. Connor's being nice to let her try, but this is embarrassing. Someone should have warned her this isn't beginner-friendly." Lisa Montgomery, who had been watching from the registration table, approached the group. "Everything going okay over here?" she asked, though her eyes met Zoe's with an expression that clearly said she was ready to intervene if needed. "Absolutely," Connor replied. "We're just helping your friend here get familiar with the weapon system. Always happy to share knowledge with newcomers." "That's very generous of you," Lisa said dryly. Bill, the veteran who'd posted the 34-second time, had also moved closer to observe. Unlike Connor's followers, his expression showed no anticipation of entertainment. Instead, he watched Zoe's handling of the rifle with the critical eye of someone who knew what to look for. "You sure you want to do this?" Bill asked quietly, addressing Zoe directly. No shame in just watching. It was a kind offer, but something in Bill's tone suggested he'd recognized something that Connor's group had missed. Maybe it was the way Zoe held the rifle, or the fact that her familiarization with the weapon was proceeding more quickly than expected. "I think I've got the hang of it," Zoe said, settling into position at the table. "Just to be clear on the rules, timer starts when I touch the rifle, ends when I fire the action on an empty chamber." "That's right," David Morrison confirmed from his position at the timer. "And remember, safety violations will stop the clock immediately." Connor positioned himself where he could observe her technique closely. "Remember what I showed you about grip positioning," he said. "And don't rush. Accuracy is more important than speed." Trevor and Ethan flanked Connor, all three wearing expressions of benevolent superiority. Several other participants had phones out, apparently expecting to capture footage of an instructive failure. "Ready when you are," David announced. Zoe took a deep breath, not from nerves, but from the need to center herself. It had been over 2 years since she'd done this for real. Her best time had been 12 seconds, but that was with daily practice and competition-level focus. Today, she just needed to be good enough to make a point. 3, 2, 1, go. The moment David's voice hit go, everything changed. Zoe's demeanor shifted from uncertain civilian to precision machine. Her hands moved to the rifle with the fluid certainty of someone who'd performed this action thousands of times under every conceivable condition. The transformation was so sudden and complete that Connor's confident smile faltered before her. Hands had even reached the first pin. Zoe's movements were economical in a way that made Connor's technique look clumsy by comparison. No wasted motion, no hesitation, no fumbling. Her fingers found each component with the certainty of someone reading Braille. disassembling the weapon with a rhythm that spoke of muscle, memory built through years of professional training. The bolt carrier group came out cleanly. The charging handle followed with a smooth motion that suggested she could do this blindfolded. Every movement flowed into the next with the kind of efficiency that only came from understanding the weapon at a fundamental level. Trevor's mouth had fallen open. Ethan was staring with the expression of someone watching a magic trick. But it was Connor's face that showed the most dramatic change. His confident instructor persona was cracking as he realized he was watching something far beyond his own abilities. The reassembly was even more impressive than the disassembly. Zoe's hands moved with mechanical precision, each component sliding into place with the smooth clicks of perfect alignment. The timer read 11.7 seconds. For a moment, absolute silence blanketed the range. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. Connor stared at the timer display as if it might change if he looked at it hard enough. 11.7 seconds. 3 seconds faster than Connor's best time under ideal conditions. Nearly 3 times faster than Trevor's attempt. Faster than anyone in the group had imagined possible. The silence stretched until Bill broke it with a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned." And that's when Connor's world began to crumble. The timer display continued to glow with its impossible number, 11.7 seconds. Connor stared at it like it was displaying an error message, his brain struggling to process what had just happened. Around him, the crowd remained frozen and stunned. Silence. Trevor was the first to find his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. That can't be right. Timer must be malfunctioning, Ethan added quickly, but his voice lacked conviction. Everyone had watched Zoe's performance, and there was no denying what they'd witnessed. Connor's face cycled through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and then something that looked almost like anger. "There's no way," he said, his voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. 11 seconds? That's not humanly possible without pre-staging. David Morrison checked the timer equipment, running through a quick diagnostic. "Timer's working fine," he announced. "All systems normal." Bill stepped closer to the table, examining the rifle Zoe had just assembled. Weapons properly assembled, too. No shortcuts, no cheating. He looked up at Connor with an expression that might have been amusement. "Looks like you've got some competition." The word competition seemed to snap Connor out of his shock. His instructor persona reasserted itself, though now it carried a defensive quality that hadn't been there before. "Look, I'm not saying she cheated," he said quickly, "but 11 seconds suggests either equipment malfunction or prior familiarity with this specific rifle." Zoe, who had been quietly observing the reactions, finally spoke. "Would you like me to try again, with a different rifle?" The simple question hung in the air like a challenge. Connor's followers exchanged glances, clearly unsure how to respond. Their leader, the man who'd been confidently instructing everyone just minutes before, was being offered a chance to prove his theory by someone who appeared to be a complete amateur. Connor started, then stopped. His tactical mind was clearly working, trying to find a way to maintain his authority in the face of this unexpected development. "You know what? Yes, let's do it again. But this time, let's make it a proper demonstration." Trevor nodded eagerly, apparently relieved to have a path forward that might restore Connor's dominance. "Yeah, one run could be a fluke, but consistency? That's what separates real operators from lucky amateurs." Ethan joined in, his confidence returning. "Plus, you might have just gotten lucky with a loose rifle. Some of these training weapons get worn from overuse." Connor seized on this narrative. Thread, exactly. Professional competency isn't about one perfect run, it's about repeatable performance under varying conditions. He gestured toward the other rifles on the table. "Choose any weapon you want. We'll even let you inspect it first." Zoe nodded calmly. "That seems fair. But if we're talking about professional standards, shouldn't we make this more realistic?" What do you mean? Connor asked, though his tone suggested he was already regretting opening this particular door. Well, Zoe said, her voice still carrying that same mild, almost apologetic tone. In real tactical situations, you don't always get to choose your equipment or conditions. Maybe we should try it with a rifle that hasn't been specially prepared. For speed runs, the implication hit Connor like a slap. Several people in the crowd exchanged glances, apparently. Word of Connor's pre-staging techniques had spread beyond his inner circle. I don't pre-stage my equipment, Connor said quickly, but his defensive tone suggested otherwise. Bill coughed quietly. Son, I was standing right here when you loosened all the pins during your demonstration setup. That's not exactly field conditions. Connor's face flushed red. That's standard preparation for demonstration purposes. It ensures the demonstration runs smoothly without mechanical issues interfering with the educational value. Of course, Zoe said agreeably. So for a fair comparison, maybe we should use rifles in normal condition. The way they'd actually be encountered in the field. Lisa Montgomery, who had been watching the exchange with obvious enjoyment, stepped forward. I can provide weapons from our training inventory. Standard maintenance, no modifications, randomly selected. Connor found himself trapped by his own rhetoric. He'd spent the morning lecturing about advanced techniques and professional standards. Now he was being offered exactly the kind of test that would prove his competence, and backing down would undermine everything he'd claimed about his abilities. Fine, he said, though his voice carried less confidence than before. Random selection. Standard condition weapons. But let's make this a proper challenge. What did you have in mind? Zoe asked. Connor's tactical instructor persona reasserted itself as he sensed an opportunity to regain control of the situation. Best 2 out of 3 different rifles each time. Winner gets to choose the next event. Trevor and Ethan exchanged looks of relief. This was more like the Connor they knew, confident, competitive, always ready to raise the stakes. Surely their instructor could handle some beginner who'd gotten lucky on her first attempt. And just to make it interesting, Connor continued, warming to his theme, let's add some pressure. Real tactical situations aren't conducted in perfect silence with all the time in the world to prepare. What kind of pressure? Bill asked, though his tone suggested he was already skeptical of where this was heading. Background noise, time pressure, multiple weapons to choose from without prior inspection. Connor's voice was gaining confidence as he outlined conditions that would favor his experience and training. Real operators need to perform under stress. Zoe considered this for a moment. That sounds reasonable. Though if we're talking about realistic conditions, maybe we should add some other elements too, such as, well, in real tactical situations, you don't always get to choose your stance or position. Sometimes you're working in cramped spaces or awkward positions, or with limited visibility. Connor's smile became predatory. This was exactly the kind of technical discussion where he excelled, where his theoretical knowledge could shine. Absolutely. Position variation, limited space, variable lighting. The more realistic, the better. The crowd had grown larger as word of the competition spread. More participants had drifted over from other stations, drawn by the tension and the increasingly elaborate nature of the challenge being discussed. Sounds like we're planning quite an event, David Morrison observed. Should we move this to the main demonstration area where everyone can see? Connor's eyes lit up. A larger audience meant more opportunity to demonstrate his expertise and teaching ability. Excellent idea. Let everyone see what professional level performance looks like. As the group began moving toward the larger demonstration area, Connor fell into step beside Zoe. His instructor persona was fully engaged now. His confidence restored by the prospect of a more complex challenge that would favor his theoretical knowledge. I have to ask, he said in a tone that suggested friendly curiosity, where did you pick up weapons handling? Most civilians don't have access to proper M4 training. Zoe's answer was carefully neutral. Here and there, YouTube videos mostly. Connor's laugh was genuinely amused. YouTube? Well, that explains the basic technique. But you'll find that real-world application is quite different from video tutorials. The conditions we're about to set up will separate theoretical knowledge from practical competence. I'm sure you're right, Zoe agreed mildly. As they reached the demonstration area, Connor began outlining his vision for the challenge to the growing crowd. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being the center of attention, the expert whose knowledge others sought. He had no idea that he was about to receive an education in the difference between talking about professional competence and actually possessing it. In a few minutes, Zoe Patterson was going to show him exactly what 27 years of muscle memory looked like under pressure. And this time, there would be nowhere for Connor Hayes to hide. The demonstration area buzzed with anticipation as word spread throughout the facility. What had started as a simple weapons assembly demonstration had evolved into something much more significant. Participants from other stations abandoned their activities to witness what was being billed as a proper test of tactical competence. Connor stood at the center of the growing crowd, clearly in his element. The larger audience had restored his confidence, and he was back to his familiar role as instructor and expert. He gestured expansively as he explained the challenge parameters to newcomers, his voice carrying the authority of someone who knew he was about to prove a point. "The test we've designed," Connor announced, "will separate genuine tactical competence from beginner's luck. We're not just timing weapon assembly, we're evaluating performance under realistic field conditions." Lisa Montgomery approached with a metal case containing 5 identical M4 rifles, all in standard military configuration. "Weapons are randomly selected from our training inventory," she announced. "Standard maintenance, no modifications, normal pin tension." David Morrison had set up a more sophisticated timing system with multiple displays visible to the entire crowd. Electronic timing, accurate to the 100th of a second. Multiple witnesses to verify results. Connor nodded approvingly. "Perfect. Now for the conditions." He began outlining the parameters with the enthusiasm of someone designing his own moment of triumph. Each competitor will face 3 distinct challenges. First round, standard assembly under time pressure with auditory distractions. Second round, assembly in a confined space simulating field conditions. Third round, low light conditions with position restrictions. Trevor and Ethan flanked Connor like lieutenants, nodding agreement with their leader's tactical wisdom. Several newcomers looked impressed by the sophistication of the challenge design. "The scoring system," Connor continued, "will weight consistency and adaptability over pure speed. After all, real operators need to perform reliably under varying conditions, not just execute one perfect run." Bill raised his hand. "What happens if someone refuses to participate in all 3 rounds?" Connor's smile became slightly condescending. "Then they forfeit, obviously. This isn't a test for people who want to cherry-pick favorable conditions." The implication was clear. Connor was setting up an elaborate system designed to favor his theoretical knowledge and extensive training regimen. Someone who'd gotten lucky on one attempt would surely falter when faced with multiple challenges under varying conditions. "Sounds comprehensive," Zoe said agreeably. "What are the stakes?" Connor paused, clearly having hoped someone would ask exactly that question. "Well, since this has become a demonstration of tactical competence, perhaps the stakes should reflect the educational value." He looked around the crowd, ensuring he had everyone's attention. "I propose that the winner gets to conduct the Advanced Weapons Handling Seminar scheduled for next month." A murmur went through the crowd. The Advanced Seminar was a paid position that typically went to recognized experts in the field. Connor was essentially wagering his reputation and income on the outcome. "And if I lose?" Zoe asked, Connor's confidence was now fully restored. If you lose, you acknowledge that proper. Tactical training requires professional instruction, not YouTube videos. Trevor jumped in eagerly. And you let Connor explain proper technique to the group. In detail, Ethan added with a grin. The proposed stakes revealed everything about Connor's mindset. He wasn't just competing against Zoe, he was using her as a teaching tool to demonstrate the superiority of his methods to the entire crowd. Win or lose, he expected the challenge to reinforce his position as the local tactical authority. Those stakes seem a bit uneven, Bill observed dryly. Connor gets a paid teaching position if he wins, but she just gets… What? The satisfaction of proving a point? Connor waved dismissively. This isn't about money. It's about establishing proper standards for tactical education in our community. Lisa Montgomery stepped forward, her expression suggesting she had thoughts about Connor's proposed stakes. Actually, if we're talking about educational value, maybe the winner should determine the curriculum for all future tactical training events at this facility. The suggestion hit Connor like a cold slap. Control over the curriculum meant control over how tactical skills were taught, what methods were emphasized, and ultimately who was recognized as the local authority on these subjects. That's a significant responsibility, Connor said carefully, clearly recognizing that the stakes had just become much higher than he'd intended. Too significant? Zoe asked mildly. Connor found himself trapped again. Backing down from Lisa's suggestion would make him look like he didn't believe in his own abilities. But accepting it meant wagering his entire position in the local tactical community on his ability to defeat someone who'd already demonstrated capabilities that exceeded his own. Not at all, he said finally, though his voice carried less enthusiasm than before. Curriculum development should absolutely be handled by whoever demonstrates the highest level of competence. The crowd had grown even larger, and several people were now recording video on their phones. Word had apparently spread beyond the facility. Zoe could see cars arriving in the parking lot as news of the challenge drew additional spectators. Before we begin, David Morrison announced, I want to make sure everyone understands that this is still a safety-focused event. Competitive pressure doesn't excuse safety violations. Connor nodded agreement, though his expression suggested he considered the safety reminder unnecessary. Of course, professional competence includes safety consciousness. As Lisa began setting up the first challenge station, Connor approached Zoe one more time. His instructor persona was still intact, but there was something else in his expression. Now a hint of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. Last chance to reconsider, he said quietly. These conditions are going to be significantly more challenging than the demonstration you completed earlier. I'd hate to see you embarrass yourself in front of this many people. It was meant to sound like friendly concern, but Zoe recognized it for what it really was. Connor's last attempt to avoid a challenge he was no longer certain he could win. I appreciate your concern, Zoe replied, but I think I'll give it a try. Connor's jaw tightened slightly. Your choice. Just remember, I tried to save you the humiliation. As the first challenge station was prepared, Zoe felt the familiar pre-mission calm settling over her. Around her, the crowd was buzzing with anticipation and speculation. Connor was holding court with his followers, explaining why the challenging conditions would expose the difference between his systematic training and her beginner's luck. But Zoe was no longer thinking about Connor or his expectations. She was thinking about the 27 years of muscle memory built through thousands of hours of training, under every conceivable condition. She was thinking about weapon assemblies, performed in desert heat and Arctic cold, in cramped vehicle interiors and muddy foxholes, under enemy fire and in complete darkness. Connor Hayes thought he was about to teach her about realistic field conditions. He had no idea that for Zoe Patterson, realistic field conditions meant situations where getting the weapon assembled quickly could mean the difference between life and death. The real education was about to begin, and Connor was going to be the student. The first challenge station was set up like a tactical obstacle course. Lisa had arranged a confined space using plywood barriers that simulated the cramped interior of a military vehicle. Speakers positioned around the area pumped out a recording of simulated gunfire and radio chatter, creating the kind of auditory chaos that could shatter concentration. Round 1, David Morrison announced to the assembled crowd. Weapon assembly under time pressure with auditory distractions. Each competitor will have access to 3 different rifles, choosing one at random from the selection. Connor stepped forward first, his confidence restored by the familiar environment of being watched and evaluated. The crowd parted respectfully as he approached the station, and several people held up phones to record what they expected to be a masterful demonstration. The key to performing under stress, Connor announced to the crowd as he prepared, is mental conditioning and systematic training. Distractions only affect you if you haven't properly internalized the fundamentals. He selected his rifle from the 3 options, taking a moment to inspect it briefly. The weapon appeared to be in standard condition, no obvious signs of wear or maintenance issues that might complicate the assembly process. The simulated gunfire and radio chatter began, creating a cacophony that made normal conversation difficult. Connor settled into position, his movements confident and deliberate. "Timer starts when you touch the rifle," David called out over the noise. "Ready, 3, 2, 1, go." Connor's performance was competent. His movements showed the careful precision of someone who'd practiced extensively under controlled conditions. He navigated the disassembly without major fumbles, though the auditory distractions clearly affected his rhythm. His grip changes were less fluid than during his earlier demonstration, and he had to repeat one step when the noise apparently broke his concentration. The reassembly proceeded more smoothly, Connor's muscle memory taking over as he found his rhythm again. When he pulled the trigger and the action clicked, the timer showed 41.3 seconds. The crowd applauded respectfully. Under the challenging conditions, Connor's time was respectable, and his followers looked relieved that their leader had maintained his competence despite the added stressors. 41.3, Connor announced, breathing slightly hard from the exertion and concentration. "Not my personal best, but the conditions were designed to be challenging." Trevor and Ethan rushed to congratulate him, their expressions suggesting they considered this a strong performance that would be difficult to match. "Solid technique under pressure," Trevor said loudly enough for the crowd to hear. "That's what separates trained operators from casual shooters." Connor nodded agreement, his instructor persona fully restored. The auditory distractions are specifically designed to test mental discipline. Most people would have fumbled multiple steps under those conditions. All eyes turned to Zoe as she approached the station. The noise was still going, gunfire reports mixed with urgent radio transmissions that would have been realistic enough to trigger stress responses in anyone who'd actually experienced combat conditions. But as Zoe listened to the recordings, her expression remained calm. If anything, the simulated chaos seemed to focus her rather than distract her. The sounds were familiar, almost comforting in their predictability. She selected her rifle from the remaining options, a weapon that appeared slightly more worn than Connor's choice. A quick inspection revealed that the pins were properly tensioned and the components moved freely, no mechanical advantages or disadvantages. "Same rules," David announced. "Timer starts when you touch the rifle." Zoe settled into position, and something fundamental shifted in her demeanor. The quiet barista disappeared completely, replaced by someone who moved with the controlled precision of a professional warrior. The transformation was so complete that several people in the crowd actually stepped back unconsciously. "Ready, 3, 2, 1, go." What happened next made Connor's competent performance look like amateur fumbling. Zoe's hands moved across the weapon with mechanical precision, each movement flowing into the next with the kind of efficiency that only came from muscle memory built under actual combat conditions. The simulated gunfire and radio chatter that had clearly affected Connor's concentration seemed to have no impact on Zoe whatsoever. If anything, the familiar sounds appeared to enhance her focus, triggering responses that had been trained into her through years of working under actual stress. Her disassembly was flawless, no hesitation, no wasted motion, no adjustments or corrections. Each component came apart with the smooth precision of someone who understood the weapon at a fundamental level. The reassembly was even more impressive. Zoe's hands moved independently, one positioning the bolt carrier group while the other aligned the charging handle, her fingers finding each pin and component with the certainty of someone reading Braille. When the action clicked on the empty chamber, the timer read 10.9 seconds. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the recorded gunfire seemed to pause in respect for what had just occurred. Connor stared at the timer display with the expression of someone watching his entire world collapse. 10.9 seconds. Under conditions that had added several seconds to his own time, this woman had actually performed faster than her initial demonstration. Jesus Christ, someone whispered from the crowd. Connor's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. His followers stood frozen, their congratulations dying on their lips as they processed what they'd just witnessed. Bill was the first to recover. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, "what branch of service?" Zoe looked up from the rifle she was carefully safing. "Marines, thought so," Bill nodded. "How long?" 4 years active duty." Connor finally found his voice, though it came out strained and higher than usual. That's not possible. Even with military training, 10 seconds under these conditions is well within normal parameters for someone with proper training. Zoe finished quietly. The crowd began to murmur as the implications sank in. This wasn't beginner's luck or equipment malfunction. This was professional competence at a level that made Connor's advanced techniques look like basic fumbling. Trevor looked between Connor and Zoe with the expression of someone watching his fundamental understanding of the world crumble. But Connor said military training was outdated. Connor, Zoe said gently, might want to reconsider that assessment. As the crowd absorbed what they'd witnessed, Connor stood at the center of it all, his instructor persona finally and completely shattered. The woman he'd been condescendingly offering to teach had just demonstrated capabilities that exceeded anything he could achieve under his best conditions, and there were still 2 more rounds to go. The murmur of the crowd had evolved into animated discussions as people processed what they'd just witnessed. Groups clustered around the timing display, some taking photos of the impossible numbers, others debating whether what they'd seen was actually real. Connor stood motionless at the center of it all, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, embarrassment, and something that looked like genuine fear. His entire identity as the local tactical expert had just been demolished in front of dozens of witnesses, many of whom were recording video. "Maybe we should call it here," David Morrison suggested diplomatically. "I think we've seen some impressive demonstrations today." "No," Connor said quickly, his voice cracking slightly. "No, we agreed on 3 rounds. Best 2 out of 3. He looked around desperately. 1 round doesn't prove anything. Consistency is what matters. Trevor and Ethan exchanged uncertain glances. Their unwavering faith in Connor's superiority had taken a severe blow, but years of following his lead made them reluctant to abandon him now. "Connor's right," Trevor said, though his voice lacked its earlier enthusiasm. "Professional competence is about repeatable performance." Bill shook his head slowly. "Son, sometimes you need to know when you're beat." "I'm not beat," Connor snapped, his composure finally cracking. "This is exactly why we need proper testing protocols. One exceptional performance under limited conditions doesn't establish overall competence." Zoe, who had been quietly observing the group dynamics, finally spoke. "If you'd prefer to stop here, I understand. The conditions you've designed are quite challenging." The gentle offer of an exit strategy had exactly the opposite effect Connor. His pride flared, overriding whatever tactical judgment he might have possessed. "I'm not backing down from my own challenge," he said firmly. Round 2, Confined Space Assembly. Lisa had prepared the second station to simulate working inside a cramped vehicle or bunker. The space was barely large enough for one person, with restrictions that forced competitors to work at awkward angles with limited visibility. "Same rules," David announced. "Random weapon selection, standard timing protocols." Connor approached the confined space with visible determination. This was supposed to be his element complex conditions that rewarded systematic training and adaptability. Surely his theoretical knowledge and extensive practice regimen would give him an advantage in a scenario that demanded technical precision. He squeezed into the cramped space, selected his rifle, and began his preparation. The awkward positioning clearly affected his usual routine, forcing him to modify his grip and stance significantly. "Ready when you are," David called out. Connor's second performance was noticeably slower than his first. The confined space disrupted his muscle memory, forcing him to think through steps that had previously been automatic. His movements were careful but hesitant, each position change requiring conscious adjustment. The disassembly proceeded without major errors, though his timing was clearly affected by the need to work around the space restrictions. During reassembly, he fumbled one of the pins, having to reposition it after his first attempt failed due to the awkward angle. When the action finally clicked, the timer showed 48.7 seconds. Connor emerged from the confined space, sweating and breathing hard. 48.7, he announced with forced confidence. Confined space work is always challenging. The key is maintaining systematic approaches even when conditions force you to adapt. His explanation sounded more like he was trying to convince himself than educate the crowd. Trevor and Ethan offered supportive comments, but their enthusiasm was clearly waning. Zoe approached the confined space with the same calm demeanor she'd shown throughout the competition. She studied the layout briefly, then squeezed inside with fluid movements that suggested she'd worked in similar conditions many times before. Her weapon selection was quick and confident, unlike Connor, who had struggled to adapt his technique to the cramped quarters. Zoe seemed to naturally adjust her positioning and grip to work within the constraints. "Timer starts when you touch the rifle," David announced. What followed was another demonstration of professional competence that made Connor's careful technique look clumsy by comparison. Zoe's movements were economical and precise, every motion adapted to the available space without sacrificing efficiency. She worked through the disassembly with mechanical precision, her hands finding each component despite the limited visibility and awkward angles. The reassembly was equally impressive, each piece sliding into place with the smooth confidence of someone who'd performed this task in far worse conditions. When the action clicked, the timer read 11.3 seconds. The crowd erupted in genuine amazement. Under conditions that had added nearly 8 seconds to Connor's time, Zoe had performed only marginally slower than her previous attempts. Connor's face had gone completely white. He stared at the timer like it was a death sentence, which in terms of his reputation, it essentially was. 11.3, someone said in disbelief. "In that confined space?" "Ma'am," Bill said respectfully, "where exactly did you serve?" "Afghanistan and Iraq," Zoe replied simply. 2 deployments each. The revelation hit the crowd like a physical blow. This wasn't just someone with military training. This was a combat veteran who developed her skills under actual wartime conditions. Trevor looked at Connor with something approaching betrayal. "You said military training was inferior to modern tactical education." Connor's mouth worked soundlessly. His entire teaching philosophy had been built on the premise that civilian tactical training could exceed military standards through better equipment and more advanced techniques. Watching Zoe perform had demolished that theory completely. Ethan stepped closer to Connor, his voice low but audible to nearby observers. "Maybe we should forfeit the third round. This is getting embarrassing." "No," Connor said through gritted teeth. "Third round. Low light conditions." His pride was now completely overriding his judgment. Even faced with overwhelming evidence of Zoe's superior capabilities, he couldn't bring himself to concede defeat. Lisa began setting up the final station with reduced lighting that would make weapon assembly significantly more challenging. As she worked, more cars arrived in the parking lot. Word had apparently spread throughout the local tactical community that something extraordinary was happening at Iron Wolf. "Connor," Bill said quietly, "you might want to consider that there's no shame in losing to someone with her qualifications." "I'm not losing," Connor replied, though his voice lacked any conviction. "This is about establishing proper standards for tactical education." Zoe overheard the exchange and approached Connor directly. "You know," she said gently, "you're actually quite good. Your technique is solid, and your safety protocols are excellent. There's no dishonor in being outperformed by someone with different experience." The attempt at kindness seemed to wound Connor more than any insult could have. His face flushed red as he realized she was offering him exactly the kind of consoling encouragement he'd been giving to beginners all morning. "Save it," he said bitterly. "Let's just finish this." As the final challenge station was prepared, the crowd continued to grow. What had started as a casual demonstration had become a legendary moment in the local tactical community. Years from now, people would claim they'd been there the day a barista from Cedarville humiliated Connor Hayes so completely that he never taught another tactical class. But for Zoe, this wasn't about humiliation or proving points. It was about something much simpler, showing that real expertise didn't need to announce itself with fancy gear or condescending lectures. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room was the one who looked the least threatening. The low-light station had been set up under a canopy that blocked most of the natural sunlight, with only dim red lighting to simulate night vision conditions. The reduced visibility would make weapon assembly significantly more challenging, requiring competitors to rely primarily on touch and muscle memory. By now, the crowd had swelled to nearly 50 people. Word had spread through social media and text messages, drawing tactical enthusiasts from across the region. Several people were live streaming the event, and others had set up phones to capture what everyone sensed would be the climactic moment of Connor Hayes' very public education. Connor approached the final station with the grim determination of someone walking toward his own execution. His followers had grown increasingly quiet, their earlier enthusiasm replaced by uncomfortable awareness that their instructor was being systematically dismantled by someone they'd all dismissed as an amateur. "Final round," David Morrison announced. To the assembled crowd, low-light weapon assembly. Competitors will work under simulated night conditions with minimal visibility. Connor stepped into the dimly lit area, his movements stiff with tension. The reduced lighting immediately disoriented him, and he had to pause several times to locate the weapon and positioning himself properly. His technique, which had looked confident under normal lighting, became hesitant and fumbling in the near darkness. The disassembly proceeded slowly, with several false starts as he struggled to locate pins and components by feel alone. During reassembly, he dropped the bolt carrier group twice, the metallic clanging echoing through the silent crowd. When he finally completed the assembly, the timer showed 67.4 seconds. Connor emerged from the low-light area looking defeated. His face was flushed with embarrassment and exertion, and his hands were visibly shaking from the stress of performing under such intense scrutiny. 67.4, he announced quietly, his instructor persona completely abandoned. There were No explanations this time, no lectures about technique or training methods. Just the hollow acknowledgement of a man who'd been thoroughly outclassed. Trevor and Ethan offered no congratulations this time. They stood at the edge of the crowd, looking like they wanted to disappear entirely. Several other members of Connor's regular following had quietly drifted away, apparently unwilling to witness the final act of their instructor's humiliation. Zoe approached the low-light station with the same calm composure she'd maintained throughout the entire competition. The reduced visibility that had clearly disoriented Connor seemed to have no effect on her whatsoever. She moved into the dimly lit area with the confidence of someone who'd performed this task in complete darkness under enemy fire. Her hands found the weapon immediately, and she began her preparation with movements that were both economical and precise. "Timer starts when you touch the rifle," David called out. What followed was perhaps the most impressive demonstration yet. Working almost entirely by touch, Zoe's hands moved across the weapon with mechanical precision. The low light that had forced Connor to fumble and guess seemed to present no obstacle to someone whose muscle memory had been built through thousands of repetitions under every conceivable condition. Her disassembly was flawless, each component coming apart with the smooth efficiency of someone who could perform this task blindfolded. The reassembly was equally impressive, every piece sliding into place with the confident precision of someone who understood the weapon at a fundamental level. When the action clicked on the empty chamber, the timer read 10.4 seconds. The silence that followed was profound. Even the wind seemed to have stopped, as if nature itself was paying respect to what had just occurred. 10.4 seconds. In near darkness, under conditions that had nearly tripled Connor's time, Zoe had actually performed faster than any of her previous attempts. Bill was the first to break the silence, his voice carrying genuine awe. "Ma'am, that was the finest display of weapons competence I've seen in 40 years of military service." The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause. Even people who'd come expecting to see Connor Hayes demonstrate his expertise found themselves cheering for the quiet woman who'd just redefined their understanding of professional competence. Connor stood at the edge of the crowd, his face a mask of devastation. 3 challenges, 3 devastating defeats. His credibility as a tactical instructor had been utterly destroyed in front of dozens of witnesses, many of whom had been recording video. Trevor approached him hesitantly. "Connor, maybe we should—" "Don't," Connor said sharply, then softened his tone. "Just don't." As the crowd began to disperse, people approached Zoe with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Questions flew about her military service, her training methods, her willingness to provide instruction to the local tactical community. "Where did you learn to do that?" asked a young woman who'd been watching from the crowd. 27 years of practice, Zoe replied simply. "Starting when I was 8 years old, continuing through 4 years of Marine Corps service." "Would you consider teaching?" asked another observer. "We've been looking for someone with real expertise." Zoe glanced toward Connor, who was standing alone near his truck, loading his gear with mechanical movements. "I think there are already qualified instructors in this community," she said diplomatically. Lisa Montgomery approached with a broad smile. "That was incredible. I knew you had skills, but that level of performance—" "It's just muscle memory," Zoe said. "Nothing magical about it." "Nothing magical," Bill agreed, "but 27 years of the right kind of practice. That's what real expertise looks like." As the crowd continued to thin, David Morrison approached Zoe with a serious expression. "About that curriculum development position we discussed ... Zoe held up a hand. "I'm not interested in taking anyone's job. I just wanted to make a point about not judging people by appearances." "The point's been made," David said with a grin. "Question is, what do we do with it?" Connor finally approached, his gear bags slung over his shoulder. His face showed the exhaustion of someone who'd just watched his entire professional identity collapse. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "And an acknowledgement. You're clearly operating at a level I didn't know existed." Zoe studied his face, seeing genuine humility there for the first time. "You're a good instructor, Connor. Your safety protocols are excellent, and your students clearly respect you. Don't let one bad day define your value." Connor's laugh was bitter. "One bad day? I just got embarrassed in front of half the tactical community in the state." "You got educated," Zoe corrected gently. "There's a difference." As Connor walked toward his truck, Trevor and Ethan fell into step beside him. Their conversation was too quiet to overhear, but their body language suggested they were trying to process what they'd witnessed and what it meant for their understanding of tactical competence. The parking lot began to empty as people headed home, but the conversations continued. Word of what had happened would spread throughout the regional tactical community. Videos would be shared, stories would be told, and legends would be born. But for Zoe, it was time to return to her normal life. She had a coffee shop to open tomorrow morning, customers who expected their usual orders, and a quiet existence that suddenly felt more precious than ever. As she loaded her small backpack into her Honda Civic, Lisa approached one more time. "You know this changes everything, right?" Lisa said, "People are going to want to learn from you." Zoe smiled. "People can learn from anyone, Lisa. They just have to be willing to listen." Driving home through the darkening countryside, Zoe reflected on the day's events. She'd come to make a point about not underestimating people based on appearances. She'd ended up providing a masterclass in the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical expertise. Tomorrow she'd be back behind the espresso machine, crafting lattes and taking orders from customers who had no idea what they'd missed. And that was exactly how she preferred it. But the legend of the barista who'd humiliated Connor Hayes in 12 seconds would live on in the local tactical community for years to come. A reminder that real expertise didn't need to announce itself with fancy gear or condescending lectures. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room was the one who looked the least threatening. The drive back to Cedarville gave Zoe time to process what had happened at Iron Wolf Tactical Center. What she'd intended as a simple demonstration of competence had evolved into something much larger, a complete reshaping of the local tactical community's understanding of expertise and authority. Her phone had been buzzing constantly since she left the facility. Text messages from Lisa, friend requests on social media from people who'd witnessed the demonstration, and even a few calls from numbers she didn't recognize. Word was spreading fast. One message caught her attention. It was from Frank, her father. "Tom Morrison called, said his son wants to offer you a job. Also said Connor Hayes might be looking for a new career. What did you do out there?" Zoe smiled as she typed back, "Just reminded some people not to judge books by their covers." "That's my girl. Your grandfather would be proud." As she pulled into the parking space behind her apartment, Zoe realized that her quiet life in Cedarville had just become significantly more complicated. The anonymity she'd valued, the peaceful routine of her coffee shop existence, had been shattered by 12 seconds of muscle memory. Her phone rang as she was climbing the stairs to her apartment. The caller ID showed Lisa Montgomery. "Please tell me you're considering David's offer," Lisa said without preamble. "What offer exactly?" "Curriculum development, instructor certification, maybe even partnership in expanding the facility's training programs. Zoe, what you demonstrated today could revolutionize how we approach tactical education in this region." Zoe unlocked her apartment door, stepping into the familiar comfort of her small living space. "Lisa, I'm a barista. I make coffee for a living. Because I like the simplicity of it. You're a combat veteran with skills that most people can only dream of possessing. And after today, you're also a legend. I'm really not interested in being a legend." Lisa's laugh carried genuine affection. "Too late for that. The videos are already going viral on tactical forums. Someone posted your performance on YouTube, and it's got 50,000 views in 3 hours. Zoe sank into her favorite chair, suddenly feeling exhausted. This isn't what I wanted. Maybe not, but it's what happened. And now you have a choice. You can hide from it, or you can use it to actually make a difference. After ending the call, Zoe sat in the growing darkness of her apartment, thinking about Lisa's words. Through her window, she could see the lights of downtown Cedarville, the coffee shop where she'd found peace, the bookstore below her apartment, the quiet streets where she'd built a life free from the pressures and responsibilities of her military service. But she could also think about Connor Hayes, whose overconfidence and inadequate training could have led to dangerous situations if left unchecked. About Trevor and Ethan, young men hungry for tactical knowledge but lacking proper guidance. About the sheriff's deputy who'd been discouraged from participating because of assumptions about gender and capability. Her laptop chimed with a notification. Someone had tagged her in a video post. Despite her reluctance, curiosity got the better of her, and she clicked the link. The video showed her final performance in the low-light conditions, captured from multiple angles by different phones in the crowd. The comment section was exploding with discussion. This is what real training looks like. Connor Hayes got absolutely destroyed. His ego wrote checks his skills couldn't cash. Anyone know who this woman is? Where can I learn techniques like this? Marines don't mess around. This is why military training is the gold standard. Connor's been teaching people for years. How did none of us realize he was basically a fraud? That last comment bothered Zoe more than the others. Connor wasn't a fraud. He was a competent instructor whose confidence had exceeded his actual capabilities. The real problem was a community that had accepted flashy presentations and expensive gear as substitutes for genuine expertise. Her phone rang again. This time it was a number she didn't recognize. Is this Zoe Patterson? The voice was unfamiliar. Professional. Who's asking? My name is Marcus Webb. I run a tactical training company based out of Denver. I've been watching videos of your performance today, and I'd like to discuss some opportunities. I'm not interested in. Before you say no, let me ask you something. How many Connor Hayes types do you think are out there? How many people are teaching tactical skills they don't really possess to students who don't know the difference? The question hit home harder than Zoe wanted to admit. In her brief time at Iron Wolf, she'd seen exactly the kind of dangerous overconfidence that could get people killed in real situations. What kind of opportunities? She heard herself asking. Instructor certification programs, curriculum development for law enforcement and military contractors, maybe some consulting. Work with equipment manufacturers who want their gear tested by people who actually know how to use it. Zoe found herself thinking about the sheriff's deputy who'd been discouraged from participating, about Bill's respectful acknowledgement of real expertise, about Trevor and Ethan's hunger for genuine knowledge. I'll think about it, she said finally. That's all I ask. Your contact information is spreading through the tactical community like wildfire. You're going to be getting a lot of calls. After hanging up, Zoe walked to her bedroom closet and pulled out the duffel bag she'd opened just days earlier. This time, she removed not just her certifications and dog tags, but also a photo she'd forgotten was there, her Marine unit during advanced weapons training, all of them grinning after a particularly challenging course. She studied the faces of her fellow Marines, remembering the camaraderie, the shared commitment to excellence, the satisfaction of passing on hard-earned knowledge to newer Marines who needed it. Maybe hiding from her past wasn't the answer. Maybe the real honor lay in using her skills to ensure that the next generation of tactical practitioners learned from people who actually knew what they were talking about. Her phone buzzed with another text message, this one from a number she didn't recognize. Saw the videos. You're incredible. Would you consider teaching women's tactical courses? A lot of us want to learn but don't feel welcome in most programs. Then another, my son's in law enforcement. After watching your demonstration, I realize his training might not be adequate. Can you recommend real instructors? And another, Connor Hayes has been teaching our department. Should we be concerned? Zoe stared at the messages, realizing that her simple demonstration had opened a floodgate of questions about tactical education, instructor competence, and the standards that should govern training in life or death skills. Maybe Lisa was right. Maybe she did have a responsibility to use her expertise for something larger than personal peace and quiet. The coffee shop would be there tomorrow. Her quiet life in Cedarville wasn't going anywhere. But perhaps it was time to acknowledge that some skills were too important to keep hidden, especially when inadequate training could cost lives. As she prepared for bed, Zoe made a decision that would change not just her own life, but the entire tactical training landscape in the region. Tomorrow she would still be a barista, but she would also be something more, a bridge between the civilian tactical community and the kind of professional expertise they desperately needed. The legend of the barista who'd humiliated Connor Hayes was just the beginning. The real story was about to unfold, and it would reshape how an entire community thought about training, competence, and the quiet heroes who walked among them every day. 6 months later, Zoe Patterson stood at the entrance of the newly expanded Iron Wolf Tactical Center, watching a diverse group of students prepare for their advanced weapons handling certification. The facility had grown significantly since that memorable Saturday, with additional training bays, updated equipment, and most importantly, a new approach to instruction that prioritized competence over flash. The morning coffee ritual hadn't changed. Zoe still opened the Morning Brew Café every day at 6 a.m., still remembered her regulars' orders, still found peace in the familiar routine of crafting perfect lattes. But 3 afternoons a week, she traded her apron for instructor credentials, teaching tactical skills to law enforcement officers, military personnel, and carefully vetted civilians who demonstrated genuine commitment to learning. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. After the videos of her demonstration went viral, Zoe had been inundated with requests, offers, and opportunities. Military contractors wanted her to test their equipment. Law enforcement agencies sought her consultation on training protocols. Private tactical schools offered lucrative teaching positions, but Zoe had chosen a different path. Working with David Morrison and Lisa Montgomery, she'd helped develop a comprehensive instructor certification program that emphasized competence verification over marketing appeal. Every instructor now had to demonstrate their skills under rigorous testing before being allowed to teach others. Connor Hayes had been among the first to apply for recertification under the new standards. "I was wondering when you'd show up," Zoe had said when Connor appeared at her evaluation session 3 months earlier. "I figured it was time to learn from someone who actually knows what they're talking about." Connor had replied, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine humility. The process had been difficult for Connor, acknowledging the gaps in his knowledge, unlearning bad habits, and rebuilding his techniques from the ground up had challenged every assumption he'd held about his own competence. But he'd persevered, driven by a newfound understanding of the responsibility that came with teaching life or death skills. Trevor and Ethan had followed their former instructor's example, approaching their training with a seriousness that had been missing from their earlier enthusiasm. The flashy gear and tactical fashion statements had been replaced by focus on flashy gear and tactical fashion statements had been replaced by focus on SIPIN, fundamental skills and safety protocols. Today's class included both familiar faces and newcomers. Bill, the veteran who'd posted the respectable 34-second time, now served as an assistant instructor, his decades of experience providing valuable perspective to younger students. The sheriff's deputy who'd been discouraged from participating that first day was now one of Zoe's most dedicated students, having completed both basic and intermediate certifications. Remember, Zoe addressed the class as they prepared for their final evaluation. Speed without accuracy is meaningless. Technique without safety consciousness is dangerous. And confidence without competence is deadly. The students nodded seriously. Unlike Connor's original followers, who'd been drawn by the promise of looking tactical, this group understood that real expertise required humility, practice, and constant learning. As the evaluations proceeded, Zoe reflected on the broader changes that had rippled through the regional tactical community. Instructors who couldn't demonstrate their claimed competencies had quietly disappeared from the scene. Training programs had shifted focus from marketing appeal to actual skill development. Students had become more discerning, asking harder questions about their instructors' backgrounds and qualifications. The transformation hadn't been without controversy. Some longtime instructors had resented the new standards, arguing that Zoe's military background created unrealistic expectations for civilian instructors. Others had complained that the certification process was too rigorous for recreational shooters, but the results spoke for themselves. Accident rates at certified facilities had dropped to nearly zero. Student competency scores had improved dramatically. Law enforcement agencies that had adopted the new training standards reported better performance and fewer incidents involving weapon handling errors. More importantly, the culture had changed. The tactical community had evolved from one that valued appearance and equipment over competence to one that prioritized genuine skill and safety consciousness. "Ma'am?" One of the newer students approached Zoe during a break. "I was wondering, that video of you at the competition, was that really your first time at that facility?" Zoe smiled. "It was. But it wasn't my first time handling weapons under pressure." "How do you develop that kind of muscle memory?" 27 years of practice. But more importantly, 27 years of understanding that these skills have real-world consequences. When you respect the responsibility that comes with competence, you approach training differently. The student nodded thoughtfully. This was the lesson Zoe hoped all her students would learn, that tactical skills weren't about looking impressive or feeding egos, but about developing capabilities that could save lives when it mattered most. As the day's training concluded, Connor approached with his certification paperwork. 6 months of intensive retraining had transformed him from an overconfident instructor into a competent practitioner who understood the difference between knowing techniques and mastering them. "I wanted to thank you," Connor said quietly, "for not destroying me completely that day." "That was never the goal," Zoe replied. "The goal was establishing better standards for everyone. I've been thinking about what you said about the responsibility that comes with teaching these skills. I spent so much time trying to look like an expert that I forgot to actually become one." Connor now taught basic safety courses at the facility, his earlier experience with overconfidence making him particularly effective at helping new students develop proper respect for weapons and training protocols. As Zoe drove back to town that evening, she reflected on the unexpected direction her life had taken. The quiet barista existence she'd sought had evolved into something more complex, but ultimately more meaningful. She'd found a way to honor her military service while building something positive for her community. Her phone buzzed with a text from Lisa. "New inquiry from a police department in Ohio. They want to send their entire tactical team for certification." Word is spreading. The impact was growing beyond the local community. Departments across several states had begun adopting the certification standards that had originated from that memorable Saturday at Iron Wolf. The ripple effects of 12 seconds of muscle memory continued to expand, creating positive change. In places Zoe would never visit. At the Morning Brew Café the next morning, Zoe resumed her familiar routine. Mr. Henderson arrived for his usual Tuesday coffee, and as always, their conversation turned to military service. "I heard about the training program you're running," he said with obvious pride. "Your grandfather would be amazed to see how far his lessons have traveled." Zoe smiled as she handed him his coffee. "The best part is, I'm still learning. Every student teaches me something new about the responsibility that comes with passing on these skills." As the morning rush began, Zoe found herself thinking about the balance she'd achieved. The coffee shop remained her anchor, providing the quiet stability she needed. But the training program had given her a way to use her expertise for something larger than personal peace. The legend of the barista, who dominated the tactical competition, had evolved into something more meaningful, a story about the importance of real expertise, the danger of false confidence, and the responsibility that came with teaching skills that could save or take lives. Most importantly, it had become a reminder that heroism often came in unexpected packages, that the most dangerous person in the room might look like the least threatening, and that true expertise spoke quietly but carried the weight of genuine competence. Sometimes, the most powerful statement wasn't words, it was 12 seconds of flawless execution under pressure, performed by someone who understood that real skill didn't need to announce itself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.